Доброго дня, шановні колеги. Проект Free Crimea спільно з Українським кризовим медіа-центром розпочинає чергову прес-конференцію в рамках
We'll be discussing the situation in occupied Crimea, and today's conference is dedicated to environmental situation in the occupied Crimea and Sevastopol. We invited Oleg Dudkin, who's the executive director of the Ukrainian Society for Birds Protection. We invited the representatives of the Ministry of Ecology and Natural Resources and Alexei Vasylyuk, but they decided probably to work for the state, and our press conference is Crimea and the occupation, ecological zone of alienation. Could you please give us our infographics that is about the environmental situation on the territory of Crimea? You know that Ukrainian Crimea has always been one of the pearls in Europe, talking about nature, unique climate, which just on the peninsula combines both continental and subtropical climate, and that unique climate has been created thanks to the relief of the peninsula, which combines the steppe zone, especially in the northern and southern parts of Crimea. It has a long coastline, unique muds, which are medical near Feodosia, near Saki, and it has a unique mountainous climate, very unique even for Europe. As to natural opportunities, Oleg will tell us about what's there on the territory of peninsula. There are four regions where there are natural parks. The natural park Cherivna Gavань to the south, Livadiyski, Miskorsky, Masandrovsky parks, then Kazantip Natural Preserve near Lenin settlement. As to other natural specific features, the main problem of Crimea is related to its climate, the lack of natural resources for potable water. Until now, Crimea depends 90% on the water which is supplied via Northern Crimean Canal, which was built in times of the USSR when Crimean region has become part of Ukrainian SSR. Unfortunately, we get a lot of information. Russians officially do not disseminate that information, but from our people in Crimea, we get a lot of information that today, talking about water supply, there's a barbarian exploitation of the sources. Neither in Tsar's times nor in Soviet times there were no needs to drill wells for getting potable water, understanding that the ecology is unique, forests are unique, and they are dependent on the underground waters. Now there's uncontrolled production of potable water, they're drilling wells. That is the beginning of the environmental disaster. They are drilling not just in steppe zone, but they're drilling in the southern coastal area where all this plantation is so unique, and the problems which will be caused by the actions of occupants will stay there even after the occupants leave the peninsula. No one has doubts on that, but the question is how serious the losses will be, because Russian environmental legislation differs a lot from Ukrainian. We see that today the key task for Russian occupational administration on the territory of Crimea is to supply potable water and also to gain energy independence till 2018, and the Prime Minister of Russia, Medvedev, emphasized that during the last meeting that was taking place 2 weeks ago on the territory of the peninsula. They are planning to launch the first energy bridge to carry the electricity from Rostov region of Russian Federation, and they are planning construction of 2 thermal power plants based on gas, and also solar and wind power plants. Talking about solar power plant, that was the company that was owned by Kluyev, the vice prime minister in times of Yanukovych, and it was seized. Basically, this company was built with big investments being contributed from the state budget of Ukraine, and also 2 more thermal power plants will affect so much the peninsula. Now they are discussing the restoration of the building of Crimean nuclear power plant, which was frozen in times of the Soviet Union, and that power plant, Shulkinskaya nuclear power plant, which is in the north near Kazantip Natural Preserve. The construction was stopped thanks to the efforts of many members of parliament of the USSR. The former academician, the late academician Sakharov, because they emphasized that that is a huge risk. You remember the construction started a few years before the construction of Chernobyl power plant, and the tragedy that took place in Chernobyl in strange ways saved the peninsula from building the nuclear power plant in Crimea. Now I would like to give the floor to professionals in part of environmental topics. You're welcome.
Good morning, everybody. I will speak Russian. It's on the one hand because those will be more quickly. On the other hand, we are speaking now about Crimea, which is up to 60% Russian-speaking territory. Thank you, Taras, for introduction. For me, it was very interesting. I just would like to add that the Crimean Peninsula, from the environmental protection points of view, it's not one of the most unique territories in Europe. It is one of the most unique territories in the world. I can make this ambitious statement because in the past I visited almost the entire world, entire countries, territories of the world as member of the Bird International Organization, and there I found that Crimea is really a unique environmental territory. When we speak about the environmental value of Crimea, we should say that that almost all climate areas are represented more or less in Crimea, except Pseudo-taiga territories, Pseudo-Siberian territories. Crimea is of course very rich in natural resources, but it is interesting from the recreational point of view. is an organization devoted to protection of wild birds. We devoted more attention to the steppe zone of Crimea around Tarhankut Cape and Kerch Capes. From late 1990s, we implemented more than 50 environmental protection projects, which were sponsored and supported by a huge variety of international conventional funds, by physical persons and even businesses. Thus, we had just 7 projects financed by Coca-Cola company, and it's not in advertising, and that's true, and this allowed us to restore precious sources of potable water in Tarhankut Cape and Kerch, around Kerch Cape, and implementing these projects, we realized that artesian portable water comes from the geological strata, which should not be drilled out, which should be better remained untouched because of geological specificities. And now, and in the past, we used only 16% of available potable water. And we have been observing changes in this approach to potable water since mid-2040s. In the past, the peninsula received its potable water from the Dnipro River, and due to this process, the Dnipro waters considerably decreased the salt content in Sivash channel, and now there is much less salt in the water, and during 30 years, which occupies in this territory, which occupies 1 million hectares, the habitats of birds have changed, and those birds, they are extremely rich. Those habitats of birds were more variable and more diverse when the water was more salt, and the major colonies of birds which existed 30 years ago, they changed their habitats. They simply disappeared from this area. Since the birds are very movable, you cannot destroy them. They simply change their location, the areas of location, and they migrated to the northern areas, to Odessa. I'm speaking about cranes, and to Zaporizhia, to Odessa, and this increased the load on marsh areas in Zaporizhia, Odessa Oblast. So this was the problem with the fresh water coming from the Dnipro River. Now, when we are thinking about the use of fresh artesian and potable water, which we never touched because of the vulnerability of those sources. On the other hand, in Crimea, the amounts of fresh water are dropping down because of lesser precipitations, and especially the steppe environmental communities and meadow environmental communities, they were influenced by this fact. On the other hand, the climate change carries out a considerable threat. And the experts prove that due to climate change, the steppes will soon become deserts. That's why the Tarhankut Cape very soon might become a half desert or desert area. And of course, we would like to slow down this process. As environmental protecting organization, we are now very much limited in our actions in the territory of this peninsula, and we were forced to stop our environmental protection activities there. Territories under environmental protection of Ukraine, I mean all sorts of natural preserves, amounted to almost 200,000 hectares, and there was 197 preserves. Now the natural preserve the Black Bay, which is now called the Tarhankut Natural Park. This was the preserve of the national value, and some other, on Karada Cape, Crimean natural preserves, that is six natural preserves, and some 14 reserves. Thus, we have a lot of objects of the reserved natural fund of Ukraine, and they used to be managed from Kiev in the past. All the objects which I mentioned are very much familiar to us, and during the last 3 years before occupation, we very actively worked in Crimea, in Lugansk, Donetsk, and Odessa Oblast, and there we restored degraded steppes, in particular in the Tarhankut Natural Park. We restored the species of animals which disappeared there, and we brought them from Askania Nova Natural Park, and this required construction of special facilities for these animals and special protection measures, and those animals disappeared in Crimea almost 200 years ago, and we brought them back and tried to restore this population there. But soon after occupation, the occupation authorities immediately started to make pressure upon the administration of this natural park, forcing them to destroy those animals, not to maintain them, and this is despite of the fact that those rare steppe animals are under global protection, and they are at the edge of total disappearance from the Earth's surface. And of course, we felt very much concerned about this fact, and I immediately made an attempt to visit those objects which we which were under our protection. And when I visited this place, I immediately found out that the facilities which we constructed, they required more careful maintenance and more higher funding. This was just an example from one natural park. Since the Crimean Federal Republic has joined to federal legislation, they now have to comply with this, and in the Russian legislation, the status of natural preserves is slightly different. That is, they have national parks and natural parks. National parks coincide with our natural parks, and all the others are slightly different.
So basically, initially, the Ministry of Environment of Russian Federation was planning to take all the facilities of the state significance, and there are 21 of them, 6 natural preserves, 1 natural park, and 14 reserves under the federal administration, under the Ministry of Environment of Russian Federation. But Crimean authorities, again, maybe I'm from political point of view saying it incorrectly, but our society, we are not political organization, we are not involved into any political movements, fora. So I'm talking from the point of view of the person who's in natural preservation. I'm the graduate of Simferopol State University, the biology department. I can say certain things, but in a different audience. I have my position as a citizen. But now we are talking about nature preservation, and the long attempt to take on the federal administration 21 facilities of the Natural Fund of Ukraine was unsuccessful until yesterday, the 1st of July 2015. The Minister of Environment and Natural Resources, Narayev, had the meeting with the Aksionov, the head of the republic, and they reached agreement on transferring these 21 facilities on the federal administration. Though from the point of view of legislation, I cannot understand how you can give the national park Cherivna Gavань, which is now called Tarkhankutsky, under federal administration. Because they don't have this category of national natural park. but these are technical details. In general, from our point of view, from the point of view of nature preservation, the Russian Federation has not been very careful with the preservation of nature. There are many organizations which are registered in that country that are trying to preserve the nature. On the other hand, they are persecuting environmental activists. They are persecuting them if their point of view does not correspond to the point of view of the official government. Based on that, we can make a preliminary conclusion that when the facilities of Nature Preservation Fund are transferred to the federal administration, the environmental situation on the territory of these facilities will not improve. Another examples, we have the Red Book of Ukraine for animals and plants, and in Crimea there's a own Red Book. On the at the May meeting of the Committee on Red Book, it was suggested that the Committee of Forestry, they suggested to exclude from the list of the Red Book a bird which migrates via Crimea. Most of European population of that bird flies via Crimea, and flying via this very narrow migration route, the concentration of these birds will be very difficult. We were working for 3 years there, and we can confirm that there are huge numbers of these birds, but that does not mean that this bird should be excluded from the Red Book, because that is the general European resource. Also, there are about 200,000 of Ukrainian birds of that type. That is on the one hand. On the other hand, that resource is efficiently used by hunters. I mean, they're hunting these birds. And they're selling the meat of these birds to the restaurants of Yalta and Sevastopol. Another animal that they suggested to exclude from that Red Book of Crimea is another rare animal. And just these two examples, when they are trying to exclude from the list of red books a bird and an animal, certified to the fact that this is a negative signal, a negative phenomenon, which will be getting only worse. Once there is a precedent, then other events like that will follow. Thank you, Oleg Dudkin, for this very long and detailed explanation. We see that environmentalists continue to monitor the situation. Most of your colleagues, they cannot do that physically, and then we met in this studio with the representatives of religious organizations, with those who are in humanities, and it is difficult to hear that the representatives of such a non-political profession as environmentalists, the profession which is not connected to human beings even, but your profession even is facing such serious obstacles, and that is another evidence that in Crimea today There's not a single sphere left where occupational authorities would not be interfering. Now I would like to give the floor to the expert, Roman Ostapchuk, who was preparing these infographics. Roman, we did not mention about these figures to the left. Please comment. You yourself for a long time was a civil servant, and Roman was working in Artek pioneer camp. And once you worked in Artek, that means that you are from Crimea. Thank you for this opportunity. I remember the figures. I will start from saying that it is very difficult to get some open information about Crimea, about the environmental situation, social, humanitarian sphere in Crimea, because all the data is under the cover. We took all this data from open sources. Let's start from this figure 269. The main problem of Crimea is the problem of the waste heaps, which are chaotic. 269 of such chaotic waste heaps are now in Crimea. Out of them, only 23 are official waste sites. 53 million cubic meters of waste is located on the peninsula of Crimea. Another big problem now in Crimea is the problem of access to potable water. Even the Prime Minister, the Minister on Environment of Crimea, this year at one of his meetings was saying that in 2014, because non-sanctioned drilling of wells for potable water started, the water became much saltier. In 2015, and the salinity of water is increasing, and that will lead to the situation that the well water will very soon become non-potable. Another problem, and that's the media problem as well, we see a lot of reaction from local population. And this is the problem that was discussed in 2013-2014. That is the development of a quarry near Karadag. And that is the quarry for small stone production. We know that Karadag is a preserved territory in Crimean Peninsula. Any works on producing natural, minerals are prohibited there. But we see that the local authorities are closing eyes to the development of this quarry. And that may lead to negative consequences for the environment in this region, and also it will worsen the recreational situation and will damage the touristic sphere of the whole of Crimea and Karadag in particular. Thank you, Roman, for your information, which does not inspire, but one of the functions of our project is to register all the facts without any emotions, the facts of crimes, including crimes in the environmental sphere. And we see that there are many examples of that in this unique region of the world. And dear colleagues, if you have any questions, please raise your hands. I will come with the microphone to you. Ask your the questions. Alexei Aranyan, Svoboda, Liberty Radio. My question is to Oleg and Taras. In the first part of the presentation, you were saying that many environmental problems are related to the fact that the water from Dnipro does not get to Crimea. And the decision on supply of this water depends not on Russian Federation but on Ukraine. I would like to hear from Oleg. What is your position as an ecologist? Is it worth restore the supply of water? And Taras is a political science analyst. And you mentioned that all these things are crimes of the authorities of Crimea. How do you assess the work of Ukrainian law enforcers because these crimes are taking place on the territory of Ukraine? Well, you know, I will start from the second part of your question. There is an autonomous Republic of Crimea set up, and the Department of the Interior Ministry is set up for the Republic of Crimea, and I believe that the issues of nature preservation is another issue which is to be addressed, and I can guarantee that we will ask this question to Ukrainian authorities, because all the bodies of the prosecutors' inspection are to be restored, because that does not fall under the Ministry of Interior. There should be some separate authorities set up. As to assessment, Ukraine is not doing anything to protect environmental situation because of one reason. It has no access to the territory of the occupied peninsula. Ukrainian government, we know that, has submitted 3 applications to international courts on getting reimbursement from Russian Federation for the losses caused by the occupation. Environmental risks are not there, and the amount has not been calculated, the amount of losses. We have provided our calculation. The general losses, which did not include environmental, is $200 billion, and the maximum could be $300 billion. We know that there is this also appeal from some private companies that submitted their appeals to the Stockholm court, but we know from the practice of the UCAS company, their appeal was considered for 8 months, and the appeal of Georgia has not been resolved. It's still being under consideration for 7 years, and there's no ruling. It means that such appeals are to be submitted immediately, because they may last, consideration may last for 5, 7, 10 years. As to the first part of your question, political point of view, I believe that the idea of the blocking the peninsula and part of the potable water and the electricity has no content in it. We have communication with the citizens who live on the peninsula via different ways, via email, and directly we talk to them. I can tell you that there are many loyal to Ukraine citizens on the peninsula. Many, of course, all the Ukrainians, many Russians, Crimean Tatars, of course, lots of Greeks. We believe that about not less than 25% of the population are still loyal to Ukraine, 25%, that's minimum. And these are people who share and the point of view, they believe that whatever happens, but the main thing is that we are Russia, and the rest 25% or 50%, they're quite moderate. So as soon as the situation changes to the worse, and it starts changing to the worse, they start expressing their non-public dissatisfaction. From the point of view of Ukraine, I believe that the idea, and from an ideological point of view, it's bad idea to limit Crimean resources. It's more correct is to supply all these things, but at the world prices, let the Russian Federation suffer economic losses for occupation, but I believe that there should be no limitation of supply water and electricity, because the north and the east of Crimea will turn into desert, and that's what Oleg mentioned, and I agree with that. More than that, the production, the growing of rice has been destroyed in Crimea, and the northern Crimea, mostly in the villages. Even I remember, if you go there, and that's Kerch Peninsula and Armyansky, Chervonoarmynsky districts. If you go there and if you buy food, everyone speaks either Ukrainian. Ukrainians who live in these villages, they will leave. Where they will leave? They will leave either to the Crimean cities or to the continental part of Ukraine. Basically, the Ukrainian population is eliminated thanks to that policy. Who do we harm? Do we harm the occupants? We mostly harm our own Ukrainian population.
I like your question very much, and thank you very much for it. I would divide your question into three parts: environmental, economic, and political part. I won't speak on the political aspect of this question because that's not my sphere. About environmental aspect of your question, much depends on what we want to make in Crimea from environmental point of view. If our activities should be aimed at the restoration, reconstruction of the steppe areas of Crimea, we should limit the supplies of water via the South Dnipro Channel, because that's unnatural. If we speak about other objectives of our environmental activities, about the raising of fresh water supplies around Sivash channel, of course, we believe that this is necessary because there are plants in the channel, growing in the channel, and the lack of fresh water will cause the dying of these plants, and they will smell into hundreds of kilometers around. I disagree with you that a solution depends purely on Ukrainian government, and because recently I participated in the research conference in Crimea, environmental conference in Crimea. And during that conference, I met with one of the leaders of administration of the southern Dnipro channel, and he mentioned that during 2014, Ukrainian government was ready to start negotiations about water supplies. The administration of this channel was invited to Kiev to discuss the price of water, and unfortunately Crimean political leaders did not attend that meeting in Kiev, and that man, that member of administration, whose position was very much determined by the fact that he was thinking about real life, not about politics. He believed that water supplies should be continued. Of course, we believe that millions of cubic meters of fresh water, which we used to supply in the past, those supplies should continue to Crimea. Whether there are further questions, there are no questions. Thank you very much. That's why we would like to finish today's meeting. I would like to thank to our experts. I would like to thank to Oleg Dudkin and to Roman Ostapchuk. I would like to thank to the Ukrainian Crisis Media Center, and we'll meet next Thursday during our regular